I think we can get started now. Good evening, everyone. I'm Anthony Maricola, Manager of Adult Services at New Canaan Library. On behalf of the library, welcome. Thank you for being with us tonight. Before I begin, I just want to ask that everybody uses that Q&A function that's on the bottom middle of your Zoom screen. And you could use that throughout the night to ask the presenter any questions you might have, which she'll get to at the end of the presentation. Tonight's program is going to look at the fascinating history of the Salem witch trials. Our speaker, Rachel Christ, is currently the Director of Education at the Salem Witch Museum, where she's been since 2017. She holds a BA in Global History from Clark University and is currently working on her MA in History and Museum Studies at Tufts University. Rachel, thank you for being with us tonight.
Thank you for having me. I'm very excited to be here. So I am going to share my screen so everyone can see the PowerPoint. And we will get started. So I'm very excited to be here doing this kind of belated witchy talk a little bit after Halloween. So as was just said, my name is Rachel Christ. I am the Director of Education at the Salem Witch Museum. So before we dive into the subject of today, I always like to start virtual events by just going over a little bit about our museum and what we do. So this is the museum that you see on screen. This large, beautiful Gothic revivalist structure is where we are housed. So the building itself does not have a relationship to the Salem witch trials, which is always a little bit disappointing for people when they come in and visit. The building is quite old, but it is not 17th century old. It was built in the mid to late 19th century, and as I said, was built in a Gothic revivalist structure. As you can kind of see, Gothic revivalist architecture. Sorry, it's been a long day. My brain's a little tired. So as you can see, this building looks like a church, and that's because it originally was used as a church. It was the Second Unitarian Church of Salem. It was used as a church for several decades, and then in the early 20th century, the congregation disbanded. The building for some time fell into disrepair. Actually, the towers that you see on this on the building were higher at one time and were struck by lightning at this point, and towers were reduced in size. The building was used once again starting in the 1950s. It was actually an antique car museum, which is quite odd considering the fact that this is such an old building. If you've ever been inside our museum, it's kind of a strange setup for a car museum. So I always find that very strange and try to imagine what it would have looked like seeing cars in there, and it really does not quite compute. Sorry, I got distracted by the chat, just making sure everything's still going. And then our museum was founded in 1972, the Salem Witch Museum. We've been there ever since. We're just about to come up to our 50th anniversary. Our museum was actually the first museum in Salem to tell the story of the Salem witch trials. There had been others. There had been interest in the Salem witch trials growing up until the 1970s, but there was no museum in Salem that told the story of the Salem witch trials and was a resource for interested visitors to come and learn about the trials. Before 1972, if you wanted to learn about the Salem witch trials, you had to go to what is now part of the Peabody Essex Museum, was then the Essex Institute, and look at the original court documents, which is interesting for some, but not the best way to learn a comprehensive, telling of the Salem witch trials story. So our museum is a two-part presentation. You see, visitors who come to our museum will see one presentation that's all about the history of the Salem witch trials. It's an audiovisual presentation where you see tableaus illuminated that tell you the story of the Salem witch trials kind of point by point throughout the year 1692. And then visitors go into a second exhibit room where we talk about the word witch and how that image has changed and evolved over time, and what the word witch hunt has meant over time. So that exhibit is focused more so on the European witch trials and how we get to Salem in 1692. So that's just a little brief introduction as to who we are and what I do. And with that, we are going to get started with our program today. So if we're going to talk about the Salem witch trials, we have to start with a very basic question. What is a witch? So this word is very different if we are in different time periods. So for example, if I ask you today, what is a witch? This might be an image that first comes to mind. So as I'm sure most of you know, this is Margaret Hamilton, actress Margaret Hamilton, playing her iconic role of the Wicked Witch of the West in the 1939 film, The Wizard of Oz. Now, this role is truly iconic for many reasons, but actually a really fun fact about Margaret Hamilton in this film is this is the first time you actually see a pop culture witch with green skin. So this is largely, The Wizard of Oz, the film, is largely attributed to the fact that we depict witches with green skin today. So that's actually a pretty new characteristic that has been added to our stereotypical witch over time. Now, some of you may think of a witch as this. So this is a very different depiction of a witch. This is Hermione Granger from the book series and film series Harry Potter. So I include this image just to get us thinking about how today witches can be this kind of scary, haggard villain who flies on a broomstick and tries to hunt down Dorothy. But it can also be a term for the hero of a story, a supernatural woman who you want to be, the heroine. So that's a really interesting difference. And in this presentation today, we are going to talk about at the very end how we get from the historic definition of a witchcraft to our modern day definitions of witchcraft today. So with that being said, this is the image that people in the 17th century would have thought of when they were thinking of the word witch. So in the 17th century, witches are very different than what we think of witches today. Witches were not good. They were not heroes in the story. This was never a possibility for a witch. In fact, a witch was an extremely serious and extremely religious term that was used throughout this period. So witches are basically the worst thing a person can be in society. And it's very important for us to remember that this is a term that exists in this context in a very Christian society. So witches during this time are people who have made a pact with the devil and in return been given supernatural powers. So again, that's very much predicated on the belief in the Christian devil and the belief in the devil's powers that permeated throughout this time. So a person who was thought to have made a pact with the devil was not a good person, was not an exemplary person by any means. This was basically the worst thing you could do during this time. Witches were absolutely the villains in your community. They were people that had gone to the absolute extreme, turned their back on God, and decided to embrace all that is evil. So it's very much not a good term. Now, it's also important to remember, witches are very real to people during this time. Now, living in the 21st century, it's kind of hard for us to imagine living in a world where the supernatural is thought to be real. But we need to kind of take off our age of science hats, put it to the side, and think about this in terms of the 17th century. This is a period before the Age of Enlightenment, before the scientific revolution. And people during this time absolutely believe in the supernatural and believe that individuals are capable of practicing magic, of using magic to hurt those around them. So this is a really scary, really frightening possibility that people were absolutely terrified by. So people who were accused of witchcraft were thought to be were typically people who were very desperate, people who didn't fit into society. And again, let's remember, witches are people who have made a pact with the devil. So typically, these witches were described as getting something in return, material possessions, the promise of wealth, the promise of health. So people who were accused of witchcraft were frequently people who were thought to gain something by making a pact with the devil. So in practice, this meant those accused of witchcraft were often people in society who really didn't fit in. These were the beggars, socially undesirable women, people who had done something that went against the typical norms of society, women who had had children before marriage, women who were independently wealthy and were widowed, living on their own without a man. People who engaged in folk magic, which was something that people did do during this time without thinking that they were necessarily conjuring the devil. These were the people who were oftentimes targets during witchcraft witch hunts, and we will talk about this in a little bit more in just a moment. So this is a pattern that you absolutely see play out during the Salem witch trials. Now, with that being said, let's get into the Salem witch trials. So the term Salem witch trials is actually a very misleading term, as the witch trials were not limited just to Salem. They actually took place across Essex County. Now, the story of the Salem witch trials really starts with this gentleman right here. His name is Reverend Samuel Parris, and the events that would spark the witch trials that broke out in 1692 began in his home in January of that year. Now, on screen, we also see the foundation of the parish. So this is where Reverend Parris lived in 1692. This foundation was found during an excavation in the 20th century and can still be seen today. However, before we talk about Samuel Parris and what starts in his house in January, we do need to take just one step back. So remember this screen, we'll come back to it in just a moment. So this is the boring part. I apologize. I promise I'm going to go through it really quickly, but there are a couple of things that we need to keep in mind if we're going to talk about the Salem witch trials, because witch trials tend to happen during times of fear and tension. Usually there's pressure that's building and building on a community that is then sparked by a witch hunt. And we'll talk about that a little bit in just a moment. But I do want to take a moment to talk about the tension that's building in Salem during this time. So something that's really important to consider is the Massachusetts Bay Colony Charter. So this charter had been taken away in 1684. Now that was a huge deal. And again, I'm sorry, this is kind of the boring part where we go into a little bit more of a legal discussion. I'm going to go through it really quickly, I promise. But to keep in mind what this meant to people during this time, let's go back to our 5th, 6th grade history lessons and remember that Puritans came to the New World because they were seeking religious freedom. They wanted to practice their religion freely and in the way that they chose. Now, they didn't think it was acceptable to have other religions practicing freely. They just wanted to have the Puritans here practicing their religion together. So this was not, there's this common misconception that everyone came here for religious freedom. Not so. But it was very important to Puritans that they had this freedom, this way to build their own society, and they saw their society as a chance at a city on a hill. This was a great Puritan experiment that was going to allow them to do society the way it was intended to. Sorry, my brain is so tired. It's been a long day. This was an attempt to do society in a way that was pleasing to God, to build a society in the way that they thought would be best. Now, that was great. That was very much reflected in their original charter. However, by 1684, England's looking at the colonies and it's saying, all right, Massachusetts Bay, you're getting a little bit too independent here. You're getting a little bit too big for your britches over there in the New World. We're going to take away your charter, reevaluate it, and bring you in line with the crown. Now, that was a huge deal to people living during this time, and it was very frightening. What this meant was they effectively did not have laws. They didn't have a charter anymore. They didn't know what their legal system was going to look like. Now, that's not to say that people during this time are living this completely lawless existence and engaging in a hedonistic society. That's not the case. There were still rules, there was still order. But what this meant was there was kind of a standstill. So if you committed a crime or you wanted to bring someone to court, you really couldn't be tried in a court of law. You really couldn't go through the court system because they didn't know what their courts were going to look like. So this leads to this period of just absolute fear. And it allows for these kind of tensions to just build and build and build. Things that normally could be resolved in a court of law are set to just simmer for about a decade, and that it has very significant ramifications. Now, they do get a new charter in 1692, but as we're going to see, that dramatically impacts the way the Salem witch trials break out. Now, also a couple of other important things to remember during this time. There's this extreme fear of Native Americans permeating the colony during this time. There had been wars with Native Americans for decades up until this period, and these had been extremely brutal and bloody conflicts that were producing enormous casualties on both sides. Now, it's also relevant to note that Salem was an area where refugees were fleeing from these conflicts. So you see a lot of refugees who had lived through battles with Native Americans and had seen really gruesome, really terrible conflict and come to Salem to resettle. Now, some of the afflicted girls during the Salem witch trials, so the girls who name others around them as witches, were refugees from the trials, and we know saw absolutely devastating things while they were living in Maine. Some of them saw their parents executed, saw their friends and neighbors executed in brutal battles. So again, something to keep in mind, this ever-present fear of Native Americans that was very real to the people in Salem Village. And then on top of that, we've also got this factional conflict in Salem Village. Now, this is an image that shows you Salem Town and Salem Village, which in the 17th century, in the 21st century is Salem and Danvers. So another kind of common misconception about the Salem witch trials is they did not start in Salem. And in fact, the main accusers and the first examinations all take place in Salem Village, which is modern day Danvers. Now, the actual trials themselves did take place in Salem, but again, it's relevant to note this is kind of a misnomer calling them the Salem witch trials. So there's this conflict building between Salem Town and Salem Village in the years leading up to 1692. The big problem here is that Salem Village wants independence from Salem Town. They want to form their own entity, and the town doesn't want to let them go. So for years, they've been battling back and forth. Again, remember, they really can't resolve this in a court of law during this time, so tensions are really just simmering. Eventually, Salem Village is given the right to form their own church. So they were allowed to form their own meeting house and have a separate church, but they are still technically part of Salem Town. They were still connected together. And again, people feel very strongly about this, and this is a huge issue leading up to 1692. Now that's great. They get the chance to have their own church. You'd think people would be happy. And while they were happy, they were still having a huge problem determining who should be their minister. So in the span of about 20 years, Salem Village went through 4 different ministerial candidates, which was very unusual for this period. So essentially what you see happen is this micro-factional crisis taking place in Salem Village. Half the village wants the minister, the other half doesn't, and they're fighting each other for who should stay and who should be ordained. Now, the problem was, if you didn't want this person, this new candidate, to be your minister, what you would do as a resident of Salem Village is just stop paying your share of his salary. Now, at this time, the minister's salary is things like firewood, things that you really need to live through the winter. And remember, New England, Massachusetts winters are very brutal and very cold, especially during this period. So this was a huge issue that was really causing a lot of problems amongst the villagers themselves. Now in 1692, we finally have the newest candidate, Samuel Parris, and he has officially become the ordained minister of Salem Village. So great, they did pick a minister. Again, you'd think things would settle down. They do not, because again, they cannot agree on what his salary should be. And Reverend Parris is kind of a problematic guy. He wants a salary, he wants to stay, but he's making kind of ridiculous claims, and he's really inflaming the situation. And he starts preaching these sermons that are very aggressive, that are very based in fire and brimstone kind of rhetoric. And it was very, even for a Puritan, kind of aggressive language that was talking about the powers of the devil and loyalty you should see in a congregation and so on. So this brings us to the year 1692. So again, you don't need to remember a lot of those specifics, but just keep in mind, there's this huge brewing conflict. People are scared. Their everyday lives seem kind of open to question, and people are really worried about, what's going to happen one day to the next. So in January of 1692, Samuel Parris's daughter and niece, Betty and Abigail Williams, begin to exhibit strange behavior. So they start clutching their heads, falling to the ground, screaming, making animal noises. And it's very frightening to the adults who are witnessing this behavior. No one can really agree on what it is or why the girls are sick. They try all the typical remedies. They try fasting, they try prayer. Nothing is working. And they call in a doctor. And the doctor says, I don't have a medical explanation for this. My assessment is it must be the work of a witch. It's the work of the devil and bewitchment. And this is really what sparks the Salem witch trials. So what happens from here is the adults go to Betty and Abigail and they say, the reason why you're sick is you're being hurt by a witch. Who is hurting you? We know there's a witch in the community. And eventually they come up with 3 names: Sarah Good, Sarah Osborne, and Tituba. Now, to go back to what we just talked about these archetypes of a witch accusation, these women are perfect candidates for a witchcraft accusation during this time. They're all women that really don't quite fit into society. So Sarah Good was a beggar. She was known to go house to house begging, and if you didn't give her as much as she felt she deserved, she would curse at you, she would yell, she would mutter under her breath, all things a woman is not supposed to do in 17th century New England. Sarah Osborne had scandalized the community because she had married one of her servants, which again, very much should not do during this time. And then on top of that, she'd also been sick for some time and hadn't been to church. Now, Tituba was a slave. We don't know exactly what her ethnicity is, but we think that she came from somewhere in South America. And for this reason, she's already at the lowest rung of society. She's about as low as you can be in a Puritan colony. So these are the three women that are initially named as a witch. Now, this is testimony that comes from one of the examinations of these accused. Now, this is an image of the actual court document from this examination. And as you can see on screen, I've pulled out a quote from this document. You can see some of the language that was being used to describe what these supposed witches were doing to these girls. They say that they had been afflicted by pains in their head and other parts of their body. They'd been pinched. They had been hurt by these women of Salem Village. Now, this is an image of Ingersoll's ordinary. This is where the pretrial examinations took place. Now, this building is not the actual Ingersoll's ordinary. This is a more contemporary structure, but this is an image of where this ordinary was located. An ordinary in the 17th century was basically a tavern. So because there was such interest in these trials taking place in Salem, they couldn't hold the pretrial examinations in the meeting house, and they actually had to move to the ordinary to accommodate more people. Now, keep in mind, these are not witch trials yet. They can't have a trial because they don't yet have a charter, but they can examine the witches with magistrates and, gather some information, gather some evidence. So Sarah Good, Sarah Osborne, and Tituba are all brought before the court. Sarah Good and Sarah Osborne are declared and are examined, and they declare they are innocent. They say, I am not a witch. I don't know what you're talking about. You've got the wrong person. However, when Tituba is brought before the court, she fully admits to being a witch, and she says there are other witches among us in Salem in this area. Now, that's a very shocking statement, and people were absolutely terrified by this sentence. Now, this begs the question, why would Tituba say something like this? This is a question that historians have grappled with for centuries. Now, what's really important to keep in mind here, again, is Tituba is a slave. She knows going into this trial, no one is going to come to her defense. No one is going to stand up for her in court. And there's a very small chance that she is going to get out of this cleared of all charges with a sorry from the court. So it's possible that she goes into the courtroom and she tells them what she knows they want to hear. And again, this is a transcript from the examination of Tituba, and you can see a piece of this transcript on screen. So you can get a sense of what it would have been like to be in this courtroom, especially for Tituba. You can see the magistrate that's questioning her is just absolutely persistent. And this is a very short segment of this trial, but this is a very aggressive part of this, the initial examination, is they're saying, Tituba, do you have any familiarity with being a witch? No. Why did you hurt them? I do not hurt them. Who did? The devil, for aught I know. Did you ever see the devil? The devil came to me and bid me serve him. So it's just this back and forth of, are you a witch? No. But how long have you been a witch? I am not a witch. But when did the devil first come to you? They don't give her a chance to declare her innocence. And it seems as though she very quickly realizes that she's not going to get out of this cleared of all charges. And she tells them what she knows they want to hear. And this is what they want to hear, but it's also very frightening. She says, I am a witch and there are other witches. And that sparks what we call a chain reaction witch hunt, because now the court needs to find the other witches in the community. They're not done examining. They need to keep going. So as I said, these first few women who are accused really fit the classic archetype of an accused witch. But as the trials continue on, you really start to see accusations reaching into all strata of society, and you start to see people who normally would never have been named as a witch being accused by the afflicted witnesses, which again are the individuals who claim they're being hurt by the devil and by witches and give testimony in open court to that effect. So one individual who is particularly strange, who's a very unusual person to have been accused of witchcraft, is Rebecca Nurse. And I'm sure that name might be familiar to some of you if you've done any amount of reading or research, or you read The Crucible about the Salem witch trials. This name probably sticks out to you. Rebecca Nurse was a 71-year-old woman who is the matriarch of a large and prosperous family. She had children, she had grandchildren, she didn't have a speck on her reputation. She was like a model Puritan. And at this time, it's important that she had many healthy living children, because it really meant something at this time if you had children, because it meant that God had smiled on you. You were doing something to please God, you were in his favor. So again, why would she have been accused of witchcraft? So it's really interesting to, again, compare Rebecca Nurse's examination with Tituba's, because you actually see a very similar strain of questioning. You see this absolute insistence that they confess to their sins, that they confess they are a witch. So even someone like Rebecca Nurse, who should have been treated with more respect and decorum, is given kind of no option and is told to confess. So I use this quote from Rebecca Nurse's examination to really show us a window into these courtrooms. I think this is a really human moment that we can sometimes glimpse when we're looking at these antique documents. When we're looking at the documents of the 17th century, every once in a while we see these kind of shimmers of a person's personality. So in this quote, we see John Hathorne, who is using this kind of rigorous, aggressive questioning. And he says, "How can you look at the afflicted and stand there with dry eyes while so many are weeping to see these children in pain?" And Rebecca Nurse stands there and she says, "You do not know my heart." And I think that's just such a powerful sentence that really shows us in such a brief way who Rebecca Nurse was and how she was handling this courtroom. So this right here is an image of the Rebecca Nurse homestead. This is where Rebecca Nurse lived in the 17th century with her family. Now, the entire building is not from the 17th century, but parts of it actually are. So Rebecca Nurse did live in some parts of this house during the 17th century. Now, this is a fully operational historic house museum today. So if we're ever able to freely travel again and you're ever in Danvers, Massachusetts, please go by the Rebecca Nurse homestead. It's absolutely worth a visit. So as I said, Rebecca Nurse is not a normal, a typical witchcraft accusation. So why was she accused? This is the million-dollar question. And this is a question that we could bring against so many others who are accused during this time who don't fit the model of a witchcraft accusation. Now, historians have spent a lot of time speculating, but we really think it comes down to some really human emotions. It comes down to old family rivalries, property disputes, and jealousy. Now, I always try to take a moment when I'm talking to a group about the Salem witch trials to impress upon you the reality of these peoples and these events. So as I said at the beginning, sometimes it's kind of challenging for us when we're talking about a topic like this that, is so engrossed in the supernatural. And it's really hard to empathize with these people and see them as people like you or I. However, it's really important to remember that these were regular people. They had feelings like we do. They loved their husbands, they loved their children, they loved their wives, they were jealous of one another, they fought, they laughed, they danced, they celebrated. These were people who had lives that, when it comes down to it, do have many of the elements that we see in our world today. So it's really important to think about why someone would turn on their neighbor and accuse them of a crime that they can be convicted and executed for. So as I said, we need to think about the Nurse family and what possible motivations there would be for accusing them. So what it comes down to is, in this particular case, there was another family in Salem Village that really seems to have gone after the Nurse family, and these were the Putnams, which again, if you've studied the Salem witch trials, should be a pretty familiar name. Now, the Putnams' names appeared on a huge percentage of the accusations and warrants for arrests. They were extremely active during the trials. So the accusers in that family were the daughter and the wife, but the husband was definitely very involved. He took notes during the trials. Now, the Putnams and the nurses had issues going back for decades. They had had property disputes. They had had open arguments, again, that should have been resolved in courts and weren't able to be resolved during this time. You also see jealousy as a factor. Rebecca Nurse had many living children who had grown to adulthood and had children of their own. And Anne Putnam Sr. had recently experienced the loss of a child, and she was pregnant again in 1692. We also know several of her sisters had been pregnant in recent years and lost their children as well. So when we're thinking about why a person would be accused of witchcraft, again, we need to consider this environment of building fear, building tension. The community is told there are witches afoot, and people start to turn on one another, and they start to see the worst in their friends, their neighbors, the people they've known for decades. So with that in mind, let's turn our attention to the actual trials. We come to the court of Oyer and Terminer. So finally, in May of 1692, the charter arrives. Yay! However, the charter lands in Massachusetts Bay Colony, but it was going to take some time to really put the charter into effect. They now knew what England wanted from them. They knew how England had established their legal system, but now they needed to elect new officials. They needed to rewrite laws. This was a long process that was going to take some time. And by this point, by May, again, remember, the first accusations are taking place in really early March. By May, the jails are really starting to fill. People have been accused of witchcraft and are waiting for trial. And the governor of Massachusetts, Governor William Phips, recognizes this and says, we have to do something. We have to do something right now. So he establishes the emergency court, the court of Oyer and Terminer, which means to hear and to determine. Now, again, this is not the actual building that the court of Oyer and Terminer was housed in. However, this is the land where the court sat. So from here, if you can believe it, things actually get even more chaotic. So at this point, people have been waiting in jail for weeks, if not months, and many still had months to go before they would see a trial. 4 jails were used in total to hold an enormous amount of people during this period. So these jails were located in Salem, in Boston, in Ipswich, and in Cambridge. It's estimated that as many as 200 people were arrested and imprisoned during this year. So that's a lot of people that are taking up an enormous amount of space in these jails. So the jail in Salem was located actually right around the corner from where our building sits today. At this time, it was on a street known as Prison Lane for obvious reasons. Today, it's actually the crossing of Federal Street and St. Peter Street. So the picture that we have on screen right now is from 1930 and is the location of the jail. So you can see it at the early 20th century. And this is where it stands today, again, at that crossing of St. Peter Street and Federal Street. And it is currently actually an office building. So this image right here is of an object in our museum's collection. This beam is from the original Salem jail and was discovered during an excavation in the mid-20th century. So imprisonment was a terrible, terrible experience. And I always try to take a minute to talk about the experience of imprisonment when we're examining the Salem witch trials. Because sometimes when people hear the amount of people who were executed during the Salem witch trials, which is 20 individuals, they're actually really surprised that it's not more, that more people weren't executed, or sometimes even disappointed, which is kind of upsetting. So it's a good thing only 20 people were executed, but we need to also consider the effective imprisonment. 200 people imprisoned in jails for months at a time, and many of these people never recovered, and 5 people did die while they were in jail awaiting trial or awaiting release. So these prisons were disgusting. They were dirt floored, lice ridden, they were dark, dismal, they stank of tobacco and dung. It was hot in the summer, it was cold in the winter. And the imprisoned were charged room and board plus a fee for your chains. So sometimes people actually went deeply into debt during their time in jail, and when they were finally pronounced innocent, were not able to leave prison because they couldn't yet pay their bill. Their family couldn't come up with the money for it. So it gives us a window into the experience of being imprisoned. So we're not sure if the Salem jail was above ground or below ground. One historian, who's one of the leading historians on the trials, Marilyn Roach, says that she thinks the Salem jail was probably above ground, and it was probably one large cell that both men and women were held in and were chained to each other or to the ground. So again, an absolutely terrible living condition. So when it came time for your trial, the courts were less than understanding. So the most devastating and impactful decision made by the court of Oyer and Terminer was the allowance of spectral evidence. So spectral evidence was very controversial even for the time. And as the trials are, the court is being established and they are beginning to see witnesses and conduct these examinations, people are really debating if spectral evidence should be used or not used. And there's actually many skeptics who are saying absolutely do not allow spectral evidence. You see ministers in Boston writing letters to the court imploring them not to use spectral evidence, but also telling them that they support them and that they should go forward with the trials. So this is very controversial. Now, spectral evidence is essentially the idea that I can look up into the sky, at the rafters and say, I see Rebecca Nurse. And the idea was predicated on the fact that witches were thought to be able to project a specter of themselves, so kind of like a ghost of themselves, that they could control and could go out into the world and could do their bidding, could pinch you, could stab you, could hurt you. And that's why the afflicted are writhing and falling all over the floor and claiming to be in such devastating pain. So standing in a courtroom, I could look up to the sky and say, I see Rebecca Nurse sitting on the rafters. You can't see her, but I can, and that's how I know she's a witch. And that was being used as enough evidence to convict and execute someone for witchcraft during the Salem witch trials. Now, it's important to note that this was very unusual. As I said, it was controversial, and this had never been allowed in the court systems in Massachusetts Bay Colony before this, and it's never used in North America after this. So this is the only time you see spectral evidence being used as admissible evidence during a witch trial, and it goes horribly awry, as I'm sure you can imagine. So as I said, this is the main evidence that's used to convict during the Salem witch trials, and it's really hard to refute this evidence, because if the entire evidence is based on this imaginary person that I can see but you can't see, what can you say as someone accused in court? There's not a lot of logic you can reason with to overturn this kind of evidence. And because spectral evidence is used and included during the Salem witch trials, 20 innocent people are executed, as we just mentioned, and 5 more die in prison awaiting trial. So this right here is an image of Proctor's Ledge. This is where the hangings took place in 1692. So there were 4 hanging dates during this year: June 10th, July 19th, August 19th, and September 22nd. In total, 14 women and 5 men were hanged on charges of witchcraft, and 1 man was pressed to death after refusing to cooperate with the court of Oyer and Terminer. And that death, unfortunately, is exactly what it sounds, and we'll talk about that in just one moment. Now, before we do, though, I do want to take a moment to talk about another misconception we often hear associated with the Salem witch trials. Oftentimes, people think that people were burned at the stake during the Salem witch trials. And that is absolutely not the case. This is a very common misconception. So while individuals who were convicted of witchcraft were burned at the stake, this did take place in continental Europe. So there is a difference between how witchcraft cases were handled depending on where you were and also what time period it was. So typically, if you were in continental Europe, witchcraft was treated as a heretical crime, and that made it a religious crime. So you were treated with a very religious punishment. And burning at the stake was the traditional punishment used for heretics, and it was thought to be very purifying because fire would cleanse the soul of this sinner. Now that, as I said, was used often in continental Europe. Not always. There are cases of witch trials in continental Europe where you don't see an individual executed by burning. But in England and in its colonies, witchcraft was treated differently. So the crime is still the same, but the way it's handled by the courts is differently. So witches were treated in the way of a secular crime. They were treated like any other felon. So for this reason, witches were hanged. So that's an interesting fact. And now you can all leave this talk, and whenever you hear someone say witches were burned in America, you can tell them they absolutely were not, which is not a fun fact, but definitely an interesting fact. And you're going to hear it all the time now that after you leave this presentation. So with that, we return to the very sad story of Giles Corey, which is perhaps the saddest story of all of those to come out of the Salem witch trials. So the term pressed to death is a grim but accurate representation of how Giles Corey was executed. So after refusing to acknowledge the court of Oyer and Terminer during his trial, the court resorted to a highly unusual act of torture. So essentially what happened was Giles Corey is brought to court in September. Now, by this point, as we just heard, there have been several dates of execution. There have been an enormous amount of convictions, and people are really starting to lose faith in the court system. They're really starting to say spectral evidence should not be used. Innocent people are being executed, and you're seeing growing and growing popular resistance. And Giles Corey walks into his trial, and he knows he is not going to get a fair trial. So when he is asked a traditional question at the beginning of his trial, which was part of English common law, this is how courts operated during this period, he was asked, "How will you be tried?" And he was supposed to respond with, "By God and my country," which was the formal way you started a trial during this period. However, Giles refused to cooperate with the court, refused to say anything, and technically the court could not proceed. So essentially what he was saying was, I submit to being tried by this court. That's what he would have been saying by answering that question. But because he refused to cooperate, he was essentially refusing to acknowledge the authority of the court of Oyer and Terminer. So because of this, Giles is again, the court again resorts to this very unusual form of torture. This was an old method that was technically legal by English common law, but had never been used in the colonies before this time, and again, is never used after. So this is something that should now sound familiar. The Salem witch trials are really the exception to all the rules. They are not a normal witch trial by any accounts, especially for the colonies. So this is just another case of how exceptional these trials were and how out of hand things had gotten by September. So because Giles Corey refused to answer this traditional question posed at the beginning of his trial, the court elected to literally press an answer from him. So on September 19th, the 81-year-old Giles Corey was brought to an open field. He was laid on his back and a board was placed on top of him. Then slowly, heavier and heavier stones were placed on his chest. So again, in an attempt to literally press him for an answer. So as tradition goes, he was asked by the sheriff during this torture if he would submit an answer. And the stubborn Giles Corey only replied with the phrase, "More weight." So while that's a really great story and a really vivid, image of how this was taking place, we actually don't know if Giles Corey ever said "more weight." So again, if you've read The Crucible, if you're familiar with the witch trials, this is probably a phrase you've heard before. So unfortunately, there are no contemporary accounts that say Giles Corey said this. This is something that you start to see in the years after the trials. However, it's a really interesting story, and it definitely does not detract from the experience of Giles Corey and the action he took at this point. So by October of 1692, a combination of factors, including the pressing of Giles Corey, had led to a turn in public opinion. So as we said, we see this building and building and building. By the time we get to October, it's really gotten to a point where the government is forced to reassess the trials. So by this time, petitions and letters had been authored by both the accused and prominent members of the community. You see ministers writing letters, important thinkers of this time arguing against spectral evidence and therefore arguing against the trials. And all of these people were together saying spectral evidence shouldn't be used, innocent people are being executed. Now, additionally, around this same time, Governor Phipps, who again is the governor of Massachusetts during this crisis, his wife is thought to have been named by an afflicted witness as a suspected witch. Now, Lady Phipps is never jailed as a witch. She's never formally tried. But the fact that her name was even brought up by an afflicted witness was probably hugely impactful. This meant anybody could be named as a witch. And Governor Phipps was really forced to think, all right, I know my wife is not a witch. I know that with absolute certainty. If she can be named based on spectral evidence, maybe other people who were innocent had been named and maybe they had been executed as well. So because of this, he disbands the court of Oyer and Terminer on October 12th, 1692. Now, however, while this court is now disbanded, there are still people in jail awaiting their trials. So the Salem witch trials are not yet technically over. The court basically has a short recess from October through January. In January of 1693, a new court is established, which is the Massachusetts Supreme Court of Judicature, which interestingly is actually the same court that's used in Massachusetts today. And this court oversaw the remaining witchcraft cases. Now, the big difference between this court and the court of Oyer and Terminer is they no longer accept spectral evidence. So because the main form of evidence used to convict was now tossed out, essentially everyone is declared innocent. You see actually a couple of lasting convictions, but at the end of February, Governor Phipps issues a reprieve that basically is a blanket declaration that everyone who had been convicted was in fact innocent. And slowly the jails start to empty. However, as we said at the beginning, just because you had been declared innocent did not mean you were done. You had to come up with enough money to pay your jailer's bill. So there were people who were declared innocent and ended up staying several months later in jail because they couldn't come up with the money for their bail. Tituba being one of them. Tituba does not get out of jail until the summer of 1693, and she's only released because Samuel Parris sells her to someone else for the cost of her jail bill, and she disappears from history. We have no idea what happens to her from there. So though the remaining cases were cleared, there were still living individuals who had yet to have their names formally cleared. So for example, Elizabeth Proctor, who's the wife of the famous executed John Proctor, petitioned the court for a reversal of her attainder, as she was said to have been legally dead in the eye. She was said to be dead in the eyes of the law. So there were people who were living with this kind of brand of witchcraft on them, who in the years after the witch trials, though they had been allowed to walk free, they weren't convicted of witchcraft and executed, they still had this lasting association with witchcraft that needed to be taken care of in the court of law. So in 1711, Massachusetts formally reversed the attainder of several individuals executed in 1692, though not all of them. So it was not until October 31st, 2001, that every single person accused of witchcraft during the trials was formally legally pardoned. So that did not happen until 2001. But after this, with time, people slowly began to move on. Interestingly, many people involved in the Salem witch trials from both sides of the conflict ended up marrying in later years and in later generations. It takes a very long time to move past these events, but as time goes on, a larger phenomena also takes place. Eventually, as the belief in the crime of witchcraft slowly faded as a real, pressing, and frightening reality, the figure of the witch changed dramatically and entered the realm of public memory. So the Salem witch trials were the last major witch trial to take place in America. Witchcraft was no longer a criminal offense in most of Europe by the mid-1700s. And again, as witchcraft moved out of the realm of real and pressing reality, it slowly entered public memory and entered the realm of folktales and stories. So I want to conclude today bringing this story into the modern day. Now, first authors like the Brothers Grimm began to incorporate witches into their stories. So these witches were supernatural women that still contained traces of the original criminal designation. So things like the belief that witches eat children or fly on broomsticks or cook over a cauldron, these are all things that you see brought up in real historic witch trials. These were things that were said to be done by witches and were thought to be a real, an actual reality during the witch trials era. Now, because this was something that people were so aware of and it had so impacted people during that time, in later generations, this is still very much remembered. And this is why we see certain archetypes of a witch emerging very quickly. So this witch as this frightening, scary woman who lives on the corners of society and is the villain of the story, this is the witch leaving reality and entering folklore with all of those characteristics that we still see, or that we see as a result of the witch hunting period. However, by the time we get to the 20th century, we see some very different witches. So by this time, there's enough distance from legal witch trials that witches really began to take on new characteristics. So now witches are no longer condensed into this kind of stereotype of what we saw during real witch trials. Now witches have become something completely different. Witches have been stripped to their most basic definition, a person who has supernatural powers. And you see many of the archetypes of a witch lingering on: the fact that a witch is a woman, that she wears a pointed hat and rhymes out a broomstick. These, again, are all things that are hundreds of years old that come up in these new witches in the 20th century. Beginning with L. Frank Baum's book, The Wonderful Wizard of Oz, we start to see really new takes on witches. So for example, in this book, which comes out in 1900, you actually see two different good witches, which are the first major pop culture witches we see in North America. So this is Glinda and the Good Witch of the North. And obviously they get combined together into one character into the 1939 film, The Wizard of Oz, where we get an over-the-top good witch who is transported by bubble. And you can see other examples of witches on this screen. You can see how we as a culture have begun to reimagine and find creative ways to deal with this figure and are inspired by this figure. So today, the word witch means many different things. Witches can be evil or good, haggard or beautiful, menacing or charming. This time of year especially, we see many different definitions of the witch everywhere. So maybe last week you went to a Halloween party, virtually I hope, and saw a haggard evil witch right next to Hermione Granger. This image right here is possibly my favorite picture of all time. You see all kinds of different definitions of a witch all in one image. So this picture was actually taken during one of our events last October, I should say 2 Octobers ago, which was an event all about the history of the Wizard of Oz and how it impacted the image of the witch. So behind these witches in the foreground, you can see a screen back there, which is where I'm giving a presentation about the Wizard of Oz. Around the room, you can see the tableaus that are used during our presentation to tell the story of the Salem witch trials. And in the foreground, you see these 3 women who are dressed like stereotypical witches. And for this particular event, we told people if they dressed in costume, they would get in for free. So I think this is just a really interesting image as it shows all of these definitions of a witch coming together in one place. So at the end of the day, this is a complicated, dark, and fascinating history. Witchcraft is a topic that has fascinated humankind for centuries. We all want to have superpowers, right? During the early modern period, this was a terrifying reality that frightened thousands of people and resulted in some very egregious acts against humanity. However, this changed with time. Today, witches are thought of in very different terms. A witch is a figure many of us would like to be, someone gifted, powerful, capable of creating magic. In fact, witches have kind of become inspirational figures. You oftentimes see them portrayed as feminist characters that are used to inspire women and children to grow up and be a good person. Both definitions are valid and both show the evolving nature of this term. They simply sit at 2 ends of one long continuous story. So with that, that is the end of the presentation. I think we have a couple of minutes for questions, and if we go over by a few minutes, that's fine with me. I don't know if this will end at a certain point.
Oh, Rachel, that was wonderful. We do have a couple of questions, so I'll just start from the earlier questions we got all the way to the most recent. So this question is from Christopher Carlson. In the first image, you showed the devil. There were infants depicted. What did that represent?
So I believe, and let's even go back to that image. So Infants are actually oftentimes depicted in these kinds of terrifying images of, too far, too far. So actually these pictures right here are not infants. So these are actually what would be considered poppets, which is something that relates to folk magic. So poppets are essentially like a voodoo doll. It was something that you could use to harm another person and was something that witches were often accused of. Infants are actually frequently depicted in images of witches, but they're usually depicted as being eaten by witches. Again, that idea of cannibalism.
So our next question is from Craig. What do you think of Kai Erickson's Wayward Puritans?
Off the top of my head, not much. The Puritans in general are a very extreme group. I think that personally, the Puritans kind of get a bad rep because they're kind of seen to be these loveless, joyless, evil monsters. And in reality, that's very much not true. Witches were, loving, devout people. They took care of their neighbors most of the time. They, loved their significant others, loved their children. They drank, they danced. So I think generally Puritans kind of get a bad rep.
Has there been any found connection between LGBTQ people in the 17th century and witch hunts and trials?
So not in Salem, in Europe, sure. So again, remember, people who don't fit in are the ones who get accused of witchcraft. So it is, I have read cases of people who were accused of specifically being a lesbian, being accused of witchcraft, but it's definitely a minority. That could be because there haven't been any studies that have really interrogated this in depth. Something to keep in mind is it's really hard to know what someone's gender identity or sexual preference was during this period. It's oftentimes really hard to glean this from the trial transcripts, especially because the trial transcripts are basically slandering someone's name. So they're trying to say all the terrible things a person could possibly do. And unfortunately, at this time, charges of being gay are among those terrible crimes against humanity. So it's really hard to know if someone who was said to have acted in a way, had sex with someone of the same gender or was non-gender conforming. It's hard to know if that was just slander being brought forth by the court or if that was a true depiction of someone's life. But I would say in general, again, keep in mind, people who do not fit in would get accused of witchcraft. So it was definitely possible if you were openly defying norms like that for the period, you could certainly be suspected of witchcraft.
Were there acts of vengeance post-trials, i.e. families paying back people who brought their loved ones to trial and execution?
So I wouldn't call them acts of vengeance, but there are years and years of attempts for reparations. So if your family accused someone else of witchcraft, you wouldn't go to that family for payment, but you did go to the court. So there are years of litigation trying to get reparations for the experience of the witch trials, the expense of the witch trials. You see people as late as 1750 arguing with the Massachusetts General Court trying to get reparations. Mostly people just wanted to forget the Salem witch trials. A lot of people moved away. As I said, though, there's kind of this interesting phenomena of people who were involved in both sides of the conflict intermarrying in the years after the trials. So you actually see the nurses and the Putnams intermarrying pretty soon after the events, at least a generation or two later, which is very interesting.
All right, so we'll do two more. Is Arthur Miller's play, The Crucible, generally considered to be true to the Salem history?
No, absolutely not. Arthur Miller's book is a wonderful work of fiction. I strongly suggest you read it if you have not, but he makes up almost every single fact in that trial to a point where he makes up people who never existed. He swaps people's identities kind of arbitrarily. He'll swap the names of judges around. So there's a fictitious judge in The Crucible who never existed. He makes the whole trials about money and kind of a land grab, which definitely was not the case. You didn't get anything if you accused someone else of witchcraft. You didn't gain their possessions, which is a really common misconception. The court could seize your possessions, but you as the accuser gained nothing. So Arthur Miller's play is actually responsible for a lot of the misconceptions about the Salem witch trials that I actively work every day to refute. But it's a great play if you ever have the chance to read it. It's a beautiful work of fiction.
Right, actually, we could do two, if you don't mind.
Yeah, absolutely.
Why did witchcraft start 50 years or so earlier in Connecticut?
Sorry, say that one more time. Why were the witch?
Why did witchcraft start 50 years or so earlier in Connecticut?
Gotcha. Okay. So witch trials take some time to start popping up in New England, in the New World. But they're there from the beginning. The belief in witchcraft comes with the immigrants from Europe because everyone in Europe believed in witches. So in the initial years of settlement, no one's really accused of witchcraft because they're busy doing other things. And that's literally the explanation historians give, is they're worried about making it through the winter and surviving. So nobody's really has the time to start suspecting one another of witchcraft. But slowly, as people really start to settle in and put their roots down, you see witch trials pop up across the New World. So there is a large outbreak in Hartford, Connecticut. You see witch trials in other places as well. You see some in Rhode Island. So this is not something specific only to Massachusetts.
All right, and our last question, where is the Proctor Memorial Tree found?
So it's found on kind of the outskirts of Salem almost. So so if you go to our website, which is salemwitchmuseum.com, we have an online sites tour. So you can see many of the sites that have a direct relationship with the Salem witch trials, what they look like today. And Proctor's Ledge is one of those sites. So you can see exactly where it is, but it's basically actually behind a Walgreens. It's in the middle of a residential area.
Wonderful. Rachel, thank you so much for this presentation. It was wonderful. Thank you everybody for attending. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. Stay safe, stay healthy, and we will see you in our next programs. Have a lovely night, everyone. Thank you, Rachel.